My new apartment came with a terrifying secret. The moment I stepped into the apartment, it felt right. It was small, yes, but it was mine. After years of moving from one shared space to another, I was ready for something of my own, even if it was just this modest one-bedroom on the outskirts of the city. The rent was reasonable, the area quiet, and best of all, it was a space I could shape to my liking, no more tiptoeing around roommates' habits or schedules. This place was a fresh start. The building itself was older, maybe from the 1970s, with the usual quirks of an aging structure. The hallway leading to my door smelled faintly of cleaning products and mildew, the paint peeling slightly at the edges, but I figured I could live with it. It added character, I thought. The apartment had a certain charm too: wooden floors, a decent kitchen, a view of the tree-lined street below. Nothing fancy, but comfortable. The first night after I moved in, I went through the usual ritual of unpacking boxes and arranging furniture. The work was exhausting, but satisfying. The routine of it kept my mind occupied, and by the time I finished, I was too tired to do anything but fall into bed. As I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, I could hear the muffled sounds of the building around me, the hum of distant traffic, footsteps from the apartment above, and the occasional creak of the walls settling. It was normal. Old buildings made noise, I reminded myself. That's just how it is. But there was one sound that stood out. It was faint, barely noticeable at first, like a soft, rhythmic pulse. At first, I thought it was coming from outside, maybe from the heating system or plumbing. I turned on my side, trying to ignore it. Moving into a new place can be disorienting, especially when you're not used to the sounds of the building. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off. The next few days were uneventful. I settled into my new routine, going to work, coming home, and slowly making the apartment feel like mine. I found a local cafe down the street, started exploring the neighborhood a bit, and even managed to meet one or two of my neighbors. Everyone was polite, but kept to themselves. It was exactly what I wanted: quiet, low-key, uneventful. But that sound, that faint, rhythmic pulse kept coming back. At first, I only noticed it at night, when the apartment was still, and there was nothing else to distract me. I'd be lying in bed, trying to relax, and there it was, a steady, almost mechanical rhythm, like breathing. It was faint enough that I could almost ignore it, but persistent enough that once I noticed it, I couldn't unhear it. One night, after a particularly long day at work, I found myself lying awake again, listening to that sound. It seemed to move, or maybe it was just my imagination, but I could swear it wasn't coming from one fixed place. It shifted first near the bedroom, then closer to the living room. But every time I got up to investigate, it stopped. I checked the windows, thinking maybe it was something outside, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Just the usual sounds of the city, muffled and distant. I started to rationalize it. The building was old, after all. Maybe it was something in the walls pipes, or the ventilation system. I convinced myself it was something explainable, even though I couldn't quite pinpoint where it was coming from. I told myself it didn't matter. I just needed to adjust to the quirks of the place. Besides, there was no one else around to notice it, and none of my neighbors had mentioned anything strange. But then, one evening, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I had been home for a few hours, scrolling aimlessly on my phone, the faint hum of the TV in the background. The apartment felt cozy, almost comforting, and I was beginning to feel like I was finally settling in. That's when I heard it again, that same rhythmic sound. But this time, it was louder, and for the first time, it seemed to follow me. I got up from the couch, thinking maybe I could track it down. As I walked from the living room to the kitchen, the sound seemed to shift. It was still faint, but now it was more noticeable, like someone softly exhaling just behind me. I paused, turning around, expecting to find something, anything that could explain it. But there was nothing. The apartment was empty, just as it had always been. Feeling uneasy, I turned on more lights, as if that would somehow drive away the strange sensation. I checked the vents, the windows, even the floorboards, but there was no obvious source for the sound. It wasn't coming from outside, and it wasn't some appliance or piece of furniture. It just existed. After a while, the sound seemed to fade, leaving me feeling foolish for getting so worked up over something that was probably just the building's plumbing or some other harmless quirk. Still, that night, I had trouble falling asleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was waiting for that sound to come back, waiting to hear it again. In the following days, I tried to put it out of my mind. I threw myself into work, met up with friends, and did anything I could to avoid being alone in the apartment for too long. But no matter how busy I kept myself, that feeling of unease lingered. The sound didn't go away. It was always there, just at the edge of my awareness, especially at night. Then, one evening, while I was in the middle of cooking dinner, I heard it again, clearer this time, as if someone were standing right behind me, breathing steadily, just out of sight. I stopped what I was doing, heart racing, and turned slowly, expecting to find someone, or something, standing in the doorway. But again, the room was empty. This time, though, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. This wasn't just the pipes or the walls. Something about the way the sound seemed to follow me was too specific, too deliberate. I turned off the stove, grabbed my phone, and stepped outside for some air. For the first time since moving in, I felt genuinely unnerved. And that's when I decided I had to find out what was really going on in this apartment. It wasn't like me to get so spooked. I wasn't the type to believe in ghosts or paranormal nonsense, and I'd never been prone to anxiety or overthinking things. But ever since that night when the sound seemed to follow me from room to room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off in the apartment. Rationally, I kept telling myself there was an explanation. Every old building had its quirks, right? Maybe it was the ventilation system, or maybe the walls were thinner than I thought, and I was just hearing the neighbors' movements somehow. But it wasn't just the sound itself, it was the feeling that came with it. A sensation that wasn't easy to describe, like being observed when you know no one else is there. I started wondering if my mind was playing tricks on me, but the sound was so consistent, so steady, it didn't feel like something I was imagining. The next day at work, I decided to do some digging. During my lunch break, I searched online for anything about strange noises in apartments. There were the usual results: old buildings settling, faulty pipes, drafts in poorly insulated walls, but nothing that matched the specific rhythmic pattern I was hearing. I kept digging, reading through forums and articles, but still came up with nothing definitive. I was beginning to think I was alone in this, that it was just some weird thing about the apartment I'd have to live with, but something in me couldn't let it go. That evening, when I got home, I decided I would try and trace the source of the sound more methodically. It started almost on cue. As soon as the apartment settled into its evening quiet, there it was, the soft, rhythmic pulse, like someone breathing slowly in the background. I stood in the center of the living room, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. It felt louder tonight, or maybe I was just more attuned to it. Either way, it seemed to be everywhere and nowhere all at once. I started walking around the apartment, pausing every few steps to listen. The sound didn't get louder or softer, but it always seemed to be nearby, no matter where I stood. I checked the vents, leaning in close, trying to detect anything that might be causing it, but there was nothing. I pressed my ear against the walls, half expecting to hear a neighbor's TV or conversation, but all I could hear was the steady pulse. Growing more frustrated, I moved into the kitchen and turned off all the appliances. Maybe the refrigerator or the microwave was emitting some kind of sound I hadn't noticed before, but when everything was off, the sound was still there, unchanged. It wasn't mechanical. It was too soft, too human. Next, I decided to check the windows again. I opened each one, listening for any street noise, but the sound didn't seem to be coming from outside. I even went so far as to stand in the hallway outside my apartment, wondering if it was something in the building itself. But as soon as I closed the door behind me, the noise disappeared, leaving only the usual hum of the building. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the stale hallway air, trying to think of what to do next. I felt ridiculous. It was just a sound after all. But the longer it persisted, the more it seemed like something I needed to figure out. Not just because it was unsettling, but because I couldn't let it go. I couldn't live with this constant, unnerving presence in my home. Back inside, I resumed my search, this time moving into the bedroom. It was the one place I hadn't fully checked yet, mostly because I dreaded the idea that the sound might be strongest where I slept. I stood in the middle of the room, listening intently, and there it was again, faint, but steady, like it had been all along. I crouched down, checking under the bed, even though I knew there was nothing there. The floorboards creaked slightly as I shifted my weight, but that rhythmic pulse remained constant. I moved toward the closet next, pulling the door open and rifling through my clothes and boxes, but there was nothing unusual. No hidden vents, no odd wiring, nothing. I sat down on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at the wall, feeling defeated. I had tried everything, and yet the sound persisted, as if it was mocking my attempts to understand it. And then I realized something. I had been trying to track it down physically, like it was a problem I could solve by moving things around or turning off devices. But what if it wasn't something in the apartment? What if it was something in the apartment's history? The thought made my skin prickle. I didn't like the direction my mind was going, but I couldn't ignore the fact that nothing I had done so far made a difference. I grabbed my laptop and sat at the kitchen table, determined to find out more about the building. It didn't take long to track down basic information. The building was constructed in the early 70s, as I suspected, and had gone through several ownership changes over the years. But what caught my attention was an article buried deep in an old local news archive. The headline read, "Body discovered weeks after tenant's death in local apartment." My heart skipped a beat as I clicked on the link. The article was brief, a few paragraphs detailing how the body of a middle-aged man had been found in his apartment several weeks after he had passed away. Neighbors had complained about a smell, leading the landlord to enter the unit. By then, the body had decomposed, and the man had been dead for nearly a month. I read on, my eyes scanning for details. The article didn't mention which unit the man had lived in, but it did say that the building's ventilation system had been faulty at the time, which had delayed the discovery of the body. For weeks, the man's decomposing body had been releasing gases into the air, and it wasn't until the smell became overwhelming that anyone realized something was wrong. I sat there, staring at the screen, my mind racing. Could it be? Could the strange sound I was hearing be connected to that? It seemed far-fetched, but at the same time, it was the only thing that made any sense. The ventilation system, the pipes, it had to be something left over from that, right? Some lingering effect of the tragedy that had taken place in the building all those years ago. But even as I tried to convince myself that it was a rational explanation, the thought of it unsettled me deeply. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this, something I wasn't seeing yet. And as I sat there, the rhythmic sound continued, steady and unrelenting. It was as if the apartment itself was breathing. After reading that article, I couldn't shake the image of the decomposing tenant from my mind. It was disturbing enough that someone had died alone in this building and remained undiscovered for weeks. But what really gnawed at me was the possibility that I had moved into the very same apartment. The sound I'd been hearing, steady, like someone breathing, felt all too connected to the story. The next morning, I decided to take things further. I wasn't satisfied with what I had learned online. I needed to know for sure if this apartment had been the site of that tragedy. I also wanted to know more about who that man had been. Was there something about him that might explain the strange presence I was feeling? My first step was to visit the building's property management office. I figured they wouldn't give me detailed information about former tenants, but I hoped they might at least tell me more about the apartment itself. I had never met the landlord personally, only dealt with the office staff when signing my lease, but I was determined to get some answers. I walked over to the office, a small, unimpressive space tucked behind the main building. The receptionist at the front desk glanced up as I entered, giving me the bored, detached look of someone who dealt with too many tenant complaints. I cleared my throat and tried to sound casual. "Hi, I live in apartment 6B, I said, leaning on the counter. "I was wondering if you could tell me anything about the history of the unit. I'm just curious about who lived there before me." She frowned slightly, typing something into her computer. "Is there a problem with the unit?" she asked, without looking up. No problem," I replied, though I could hear the nervousness creeping into my voice. I heard something about the building's ventilation system being an issue a while back, and I was curious if it affected my apartment. I like to know the history of places I live, you know." The receptionist hesitated, her fingers still hovering over the keyboard. "The building's old," she said, in a tone that suggested she didn't want to deal with whatever concern I might bring up next. "There have been repairs over the years, sure, but we take care of any major issues. If you're having a problem, I can send maintenance." I shook my head quickly. "No, it's not that. It's just, was there ever an incident in that apartment? Like, did something happen to a former tenant?" Her eyes flickered with something like recognition. She glanced at the screen in front of her again, then back up at me, her expression guarded. "I'm not really supposed to share details about previous tenants," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "But there was an incident. It was a long time ago." I leaned in, my curiosity growing. "An incident? What kind?" The receptionist glanced around as if checking to see if anyone else was listening. Then, lowering her voice, she said, "A man passed away in the apartment a few years ago. Natural causes, I believe, but he wasn't found for a while. There was an issue with the ventilation system at the time, and..." She trailed off, clearly uncomfortable discussing it further. So, it was true. My stomach twisted as I realized I had been right. I was living in the same apartment where that man had died. I thanked the receptionist and left the office, my mind racing. I had the confirmation I needed, but it didn't make me feel any better. In fact, it only made things worse. The idea that I had been hearing something connected to that man, or to his death, was too unsettling to ignore now. I couldn't just write it off as pipes or ventilation noises anymore. There was a connection between the sound and the history of the place, even if I couldn't fully explain it yet. Back in the apartment, I found myself more aware than ever of the space around me. Every corner, every wall felt heavy with the knowledge of what had happened here. I tried to keep myself busy, telling myself it was all in my head, but the sound was there again that night, steady and rhythmic, as if something was lingering just beneath the surface of normal life. That night, I barely slept. My thoughts kept returning to the article, to the details the receptionist had confirmed. I found myself wondering about the man who had died here. Who was he? How had he ended up alone, unnoticed for so long? I tried to picture his final moments. Did he know he was going to die? Had he tried to call for help, but no one heard him? The next morning, I decided I needed more information. I had to understand the full story. I couldn't keep living in this apartment with these half-formed suspicions lurking in the back of my mind. So, I turned back to the internet, this time searching more specifically for details about the man's death. It took a while, but I eventually found a few more references to the incident. The man's name was Michael Harris. He had been in his late 50s, lived alone, and from what I could gather, had no close family or friends nearby. His death had gone unnoticed for weeks, and by the time the building staff had discovered him, his body had already begun to decompose. The article mentioned that neighbors had complained about the smell, but it wasn't until the stench became overwhelming that anyone thought to check on him. Reading about Michael Harris sent a chill through me. The idea of dying alone, with no one to care or notice, was horrifying in itself. But something about the way the article described the discovery of his body stuck with me. It mentioned that the ventilation system had been pumping air from his apartment into the rest of the building, which was why it had taken so long for anyone to realize something was wrong. I thought back to the sound I had been hearing, the rhythmic, breathing-like pulse. Could it really be that simple? Was I hearing something left over from that faulty ventilation system? Maybe it wasn't supernatural after all. Maybe it was just the remnants of old air, trapped in the ducts, still circulating through the building. But even as I considered that explanation, I couldn't shake the sense that there was more to it. I couldn't ignore how specific the sound felt, how it seemed to follow me, to shift in intensity depending on where I was in the apartment. It wasn't just an ambient noise, it felt alive. That evening I made a decision. I couldn't live like this, constantly wondering and second-guessing myself. I needed to confront whatever was happening, once and for all. I waited until nightfall, when the apartment was at its quietest, and then I sat in the living room, listening. The sound was there, as always, soft but present. I focused on it, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. It was faint at first, but after a few minutes it grew louder, more distinct. I stood up and began to follow it, moving slowly through the apartment, from the living room to the kitchen, then back to the bedroom. The sound seemed to move with me, just as it had before. But this time, I wasn't going to let it scare me. I was going to face it, head on. And then, as I stood in the doorway of the bedroom, something strange happened. The sound stopped. Complete silence filled the room, and for the first time, I felt truly alone in my apartment. That silence was heavier than any noise I had ever heard. It pressed against me, thick and suffocating, as if the absence of the sound was more oppressive than its presence had ever been. I stood in the bedroom doorway, frozen, waiting for the pulse of that rhythmic noise to return, but it didn't. Instead, there was nothing, just the quiet hum of the city outside, muffled and distant. I tried to tell myself that this was a good thing. Maybe I had finally figured it out, or maybe the sound was just some odd quirk of the building that had now resolved itself. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. Something had shifted in the apartment, and the silence wasn't a relief, it was a warning. That night, I barely slept again, but it wasn't the sound keeping me awake this time. It was the absence of it, the way the apartment felt unnaturally still, like it was holding its breath. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to rationalize everything that had happened. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces didn't quite fit together. The ventilation system theory seemed plausible enough. But why had the sound felt so personal? Why had it seemed to follow me? By the time morning came, I was exhausted and jittery, unable to shake the unease that clung to me. I went through my day at work in a fog, barely able to focus. My mind kept drifting back to the apartment, to that silent, unsettling space I'd left behind. I considered calling someone, maybe a friend, or even a professional, just to get another perspective. But what would I say? Hey, I think my apartment might be haunted, but don't worry. It's probably just bad ventilation. I knew how ridiculous it sounded. And I wasn't about to embarrass myself over something I couldn't even explain properly. When I got home that evening, I half expected the sound to be waiting for me, picking up right where it had left off. But as I opened the door, I was greeted with the same thick silence. The apartment felt different now, not just quiet, but empty in a way it hadn't before. I set my keys on the counter, listening for any hint of the familiar noise, but all I heard was the faint hum of the refrigerator. I tried to settle into my usual routine, cooking dinner, watching TV, but everything felt off. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. Every little noise from outside the window felt like an intrusion. I was on edge, constantly waiting for the sound to come back, for the rhythm to start up again, but it didn't. The apartment remained silent, and with every passing hour, my anxiety grew. That night, as I lay in bed, I finally allowed myself to consider the possibility that something else might be going on, something beyond faulty pipes or old ductwork. I didn't want to believe it. I'm not the type of person who jumps to supernatural conclusions, but the strange consistency of the sound, its almost deliberate movements, and the way it had stopped so suddenly, all made me wonder if there was something more, something tied to the man who had died here, to Michael Harris. I thought about him a lot that night, imagining what his life had been like, what his final days had been like, alone, in this very apartment, unnoticed by anyone. I wondered if he had felt the same sense of isolation that I was feeling now, if he had heard the same noises, or if this was something new, something connected to his death, or maybe even to me. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a fitful sleep. But it wasn't a restful sleep. My dreams were disjointed, full of fragmented images. Michael Harris's face, the empty hallways of the building, the rhythmic pulse of that sound echoing in the background. In one of the dreams, I was standing in the middle of the apartment, listening, waiting for the sound to start. But instead of hearing it, I saw it, ripples moving through the air, like invisible waves. And in the middle of those ripples was a figure, standing perfectly still, watching me. I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the apartment still dark and silent around me. I lay there, disoriented, trying to shake the feeling of the dream, but it clung to me. The figure, the ripples, it felt too real, too vivid. I rubbed my eyes and glanced at the clock. It was just after 3 a.m. That's when I heard it. It started quietly at first, so faint I almost thought I was imagining it. But as I lay there, holding my breath, it grew louder. The same rhythmic pulse, steady and soft, just like before. It was back. I sat up in bed, my heart racing again, and listened. The sound wasn't coming from the bedroom this time. It was coming from the living room. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up, moving slowly toward the door. The sound grew louder as I got closer, still soft, but now unmistakable. It was as if someone was standing just beyond the living room, breathing slowly, deliberately. I stepped into the hallway, my feet moving almost on their own. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it, but nothing added up. I wasn't scared exactly, but I was tense, every muscle in my body on high alert. I told myself I was going to confront it, whatever it was. There had to be an explanation. As I reached the living room, the sound seemed to shift, like it was moving again, just beyond the edge of my awareness. I stopped in the middle of the room, standing perfectly still, and listened. The pulse was steady now, louder than before, but still soft enough that it felt distant, like it was coming from just beyond the walls. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped again. I stood there in the middle of the living room, surrounded by silence, my breath shallow and my pulse racing. I didn't know what to do. I had no idea where the sound had gone, or why it had stopped. All I knew was that it had come back, and this time it felt different, more deliberate, more aware. I glanced around the room, searching for anything out of place, but everything looked normal. Just my furniture, my belongings, the same space I had been living in for weeks. But something had changed. I could feel it in the air, in the way the silence seemed to press against me, almost suffocating. I was no longer alone in the apartment. I backed slowly out of the living room, retreating to the hallway, my eyes scanning the space around me. Every instinct told me to leave, to get out of the apartment and figure this out from a safe distance. But I didn't move. I couldn't. Something was keeping me there, holding me in place, as if I needed to see this through, to find out what was really happening. I stood in the hallway for what felt like an eternity, listening, waiting for the sound to return, but it didn't. The silence remained, thick and heavy, wrapping around me like a blanket. And then, just as I was about to turn and go back to bed, I heard something new. It wasn't the rhythmic pulse this time. It was a soft creak, like the sound of a floorboard shifting under the weight of something or someone. I turned slowly, my heart in my throat, and saw it. There, in the doorway of the bedroom, stood a figure. It was faint, almost like a shadow, but it was there, unmoving, watching me. For the first time since this whole thing started, I felt real fear. The kind of fear that grips you so tightly you can't move, can't think, can't breathe. And in that moment, I knew whatever had been making that sound wasn't just in the walls, it was here, with me. For a moment, I couldn't move. I stood frozen in the hallway, staring at the figure in the bedroom doorway. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing, to fit it into the realm of reality, but nothing about this felt real. The figure was just standing there, barely more than a shadow, its shape indistinct but unmistakably human. Every rational part of me wanted to believe it was a trick of the light, a figment of my sleep-deprived mind. Maybe I was still dreaming, caught in the fog of that strange, half-sleep state where everything feels off, but plausible. But this wasn't a dream. The figure didn't move, but its presence was palpable, like the weight of eyes on you when someone is staring. That invisible pressure in the air that makes your skin crawl. I took a step back, my breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts, trying to force myself to think clearly. I should have run. I should have turned and bolted out of the apartment, but my legs didn't cooperate. Fear had a grip on me now, squeezing tighter with every second that passed. My mind raced through possibilities, desperate for an explanation, an intruder, a shadow, a reflection, but none of them made sense. I blinked hard, my vision blurring slightly as I did, and for a split second, the figure seemed to waver, almost like it wasn't fully solid, but it was still there, still watching. A sudden thought hit me like a bolt of lightning. Michael Harris. Was this him? Was this what was left behind, lingering in the apartment after his death? The rational part of me recoiled at the idea, but after everything that had happened, the sound, the strange feelings, the way the apartment seemed to change, it was hard to shake. The figure had to be connected to him. There was no other explanation. I stood there in shock, struggling to find the nerve to react. After what felt like forever, I finally pushed myself to say something. "Who are you?" My voice came out quieter than I intended, barely more than a croak, but it was enough to break the silence. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. It just stood there, a dark shape in the doorway, like it was waiting for something. The stillness of it was almost worse than if it had moved. There was something unnatural about how it just remained, motionless, without a sound. I took another step back, my legs shaking. My mind screamed at me to get out, to run, but I couldn't bring myself to turn away. Something about this moment felt final, like I had reached the point of no return. I needed to know what this was, what had been haunting me ever since I moved in. I forced myself to speak again, louder this time, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you Michael Harris?" The second the name left my lips, the figure shifted. It was subtle, just a slight tilt of the head, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. The name had meant something. I felt it, like the air in the room had suddenly changed, like a weight had lifted, or maybe shifted. The figure still didn't speak, but its attention was unmistakable. It was as if I had acknowledged something that had been waiting to be seen. My heart hammered in my chest, and I couldn't tell if I was more terrified or relieved. Terrified, because whatever this was, it had just responded to me. Relieved, because at least now I knew I wasn't losing my mind. I hadn't been imagining the strange noises, the sense of being watched. This thing, this presence had been here all along. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. If this was Michael Harris, if this was some remnant of his life, then maybe there was a way to help him. Maybe he was stuck here, lingering in the apartment, unable to move on because no one had noticed him in life, and now no one was paying attention in death. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Why are you here?" The figure didn't move again, but the air around me felt charged, like the space was holding its breath. I realized then that the sound I had been hearing, the rhythmic, breathing-like pulse, had completely stopped. The apartment was eerily silent, as if everything had gone still, waiting for something to happen. I took another step back, and as I did, the figure seemed to fade slightly, as if it were being pulled away. I blinked, and when I opened my eyes again, it was gone. The doorway was empty. I stood there trembling, trying to process what had just happened. My mind raced, replaying the encounter over and over, trying to make sense of it. I had seen it. I had seen something, but now it was gone, leaving me alone in the quiet apartment. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, staring at the empty space where the figure had been. But eventually, my legs gave out, and I sank onto the couch, my hands shaking. The adrenaline that had been coursing through me drained away, leaving me exhausted and confused. What had I just experienced? Was that really Michael Harris? Was I imagining things, or was this apartment truly haunted by some lingering presence? I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every creak of the floor, every shift of light had me on edge, waiting for the figure to return. But it didn't. The apartment stayed unnervingly quiet, as if whatever had been haunting me had finally gone. The next morning, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here any longer. Whatever was in this apartment, whatever had been following me, I didn't want to find out any more than I already had. I packed my things in a frenzy, barely stopping to think, throwing clothes and belongings into bags as fast as I could. As I walked out of the building for the last time, I didn't look back. I couldn't. All I knew was that I needed to get as far away from that place as possible. It's been a few months since I left the apartment, and I still think about it sometimes. About the figure, about the sound, about Michael Harris. I don't know what it was that I saw, or why it was there, but I do know one thing. Some places hold on to the past in ways we can't explain, and sometimes the past doesn't want to be forgotten. I moved to a new apartment across town, one with bright windows and modern fixtures, a place that feels fresh and clean. I haven't heard any strange sounds here, no rhythmic pulses or mysterious figures watching me from doorways. Life has returned to normal, or at least as normal as it can be after an experience like that. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is still and quiet, I can't help but listen, just to make sure. And every so often, I think I hear something, a faint, steady sound, like someone breathing. So that was pretty much it. I hope you liked the story. Till then, peace out.